Last session, we pointed out that our general default as people, it's to view life as a power grab, right? You better get what you can when you can. And the sad reality is that we as people, we carry this destructive mentality with us, pretty much everywhere we go. Even into our own homes. And within our families, amongst the people that we should love the most, do we not still battle for power and authority? For the past couple of years, my 7-year-old Micah has been saying that he wants to be a grown-up. And I feel like his answer is very telling about the human condition. Because if you ask him why he wants to be a grown-up, his answer is, I want to be the boss. We all want to be the one in charge. We all want to get our way. And as humans, let's be honest, especially in our family relationships, we will use whatever weapons we have at our disposal to get and maintain control in the relationships, whether that be physical strength or just a strong will, demanding personality, or just the art of subtle manipulation, passive aggressiveness, or just outright rebellion. We will even go as far as to engage in deception if it means getting what we want. However, you'll remember that within the new reality that Jesus established, he taught that relationships, they're not about obtaining and gaining power. In fact, the exact opposite principle reigns true. Jesus taught that any power that you and I have, it shouldn't be lorded over others, but instead used to empower them. And as followers of Jesus, you and I, we're called to examine the things in our lives that the world says we're entitled to have, or the things that we're capable of taking for ourselves, and we're to see these things, and then out of a place of strength, we're called to surrender those things for the sake of others. We said last time that this concept, it's called submission. We see Jesus live it out throughout his life, and we see Paul teach about it continually. And what we said was it's much easier to talk about submission than it is to live it out, especially in the most foundational areas of our lives, like our homes. As I look at my own life and relate, just the way I relate to people who I'm around the most and who I love the most, what I find is that instead of giving up my rights, I usually spend most of my time trying to get them to give up theirs. I try to get them to submit to me. It happens when my arrogance leads me to feel the need to have to be right, when my pride makes it hard for me to say I'm sorry and ask for forgiveness, or when my anger arises because I haven't gotten my way, or my favorite, when my selfishness kicks in, right? And I claim that last piece of cake for myself instead of being willing to allow someone else to have it. Man, this is a humbling experience just to think about all the ways where my laziness or frustration or my lack of patience or my sense of entitlement just reveal how much I am unwilling to submit. And is it any wonder that Paul immediately follows his instructions on submission by asking us to examine our behavior at home? Because is there any better place to practice submission than with our own families? Is there any other place where we are more continually bombarded with what I'll call opportunities, right? To lay down our rights for the sake of others. And where are you and I most easily drawn into outbursts of anger or acts of greed or just petty conflicts and disagreements? Where is it easiest to speak harsh words, and where is it most difficult to genuinely demonstrate, things like compassion and gentleness and patience and kindness and forgiveness? It's at home, right? Where it feels like the tests just never stop coming. And so Paul says, you want to make the new reality of Jesus visible for the world to see? It's not in some grand gesture. Start at home. Now, before we jump into Paul's instructions to families, we ought to prepare ourselves to approach what he writes with the correct perspective. It's so easy to just immediately apply things to our own reality. But here's the truth. Paul was addressing a first century audience, people living within the framework of Roman civilization. And their society was a little bit different than ours. For example, there was a very defined hierarchy of status, and the truth was that men held all the power. People didn't really get married for love. I mean, that sounds crazy to us, but marriage, it was viewed as a contractual agreement. Women, they married as a means of survival. Men married to produce heirs. And so what this meant was that in Roman law, husbands held all the power. Wives, they were commanded to obey. And then you get to children. Children were regarded as the father's property. Their status in life was barely higher than a slave. They had no rights, at least until their father either died or released them in adulthood. And Roman households, they consisted of extended families living under one roof, and slaves were a part of the household. Now slaves had no rights. They were thought to be incapable of making rational and responsible decisions for themselves. I mean, this is the rigid power structure that Paul spoke his instructions into. And what's crazy is the type of submission that Paul called Christ's followers to engage in to this Roman culture. It not only sounded crazy, it was actually seen as threatening. For instance, the well-known Roman historian Tacitus, he accused Christians of hating the human race because they had abandoned their obligations to family and society. Now, compare that with the world that we live in today, where individualism is celebrated above everything else. I mean, our culture preaches, express yourself and don't let anyone repress you. To our modern ears, Paul's call for wives and for children and slaves to submit, I mean, it sounds archaic and barbaric and just flat out oppressive. And so just on one side, Paul, he's accused of inspiring oppression, and then on the other side, he's villainized for encouraging anarchy. I mean, the poor guy can't win. But come on now, here's the deal. Can we just come to this text understanding the fact that Paul is giving instructions to families who lived 2,000 years ago in a culture dramatically different than our own? And within this time gap, can we identify the real relevance and application for us today? I mean, that's the challenge that lays in front of us. And so as we think about that, let's dive into the text. We start in verse 18. Wives, be submissive to your husbands as fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and don't be bitter towards them. You see, many today, they would portray Paul as a male chauvinist. How dare he tell women to be submissive? I mean, a woman can lead just as well as a man. The idea, it just sounds like nails on a chalkboard to our modern mentality. But think of it from the perspective of Paul and Roman culture. Again, consider what we know about Roman law and society. Wives, they had to obey. There wasn't a choice. And so in light of this, Paul's words are actually freeing and empowering. He actually doesn't call wives to obey. They're not called to obey out of obligation to Roman law. He appeals to them to voluntarily submit because of who they are in Jesus and their love for Him. Now remember, submission is never done out of a place of weakness. It always comes from a position of strength because it involves a willing choice. The woman of Paul's day, they were granted by Paul a value and power that Roman society refused to give them. And then we move to husbands. And guys, the demands placed on us, they are way higher than anyone else on this list. Within marriages that were not expected to be based on love, Paul told husbands, love your wives. Love them not merely with romantic feelings that come and go, but love them like Jesus loved you. Love your wives with a love that completely surrenders all ego and status. Guys, our wives and our children, they are not called to submit to our desire to dominate. They're called to submit to our love, and love always involves submission. We love our families by being willing to sacrifice and serve them with absolute selflessness. And so here it is. Whether you're a husband or a wife, can we all admit, first of all, that there's a desire within us that's just ingrained there that wants to get our way? Or as Micah puts it, we all want to be the boss. But what Paul spells out for us here, and what Jesus makes absolutely clear, was that genuine leadership, it's not preoccupied with titles. Real leaders aren't concerned with grabbing power and seizing authority. You don't lead by lording your power over people, but instead lowering your status to serve the most basic needs of others. That's what a leader does. And leadership, at least leadership that imitates Jesus, is displayed in the daily insignificant things of life. It's seen in a willingness to humble oneself and do the grunt work for the benefit of someone else. That's what we need to look at when we think about leadership. And so Paul continues. He says in verse 20, "Children, obey your parents in everything. Again, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, don't exasperate or frustrate or rile up your children so they won't become discouraged." Again, fathers here, they're singled out to be obeyed because by Roman law, the father had absolute control over their children's lives. The fact that Paul even acknowledges children directly is shocking. And what Paul asks of kids on the surface, it doesn't sound that different from what they were required to do by Roman law, but they were supposed to obey. They were required to obey, but check out where the motivation is to come from. Roman society said that children had no rights, but Paul empowers children. He bestows on them a level of autonomy by calling them to make their own choice with regard to how they're going to respond to their parents. And what does he instruct them to do? Obey. Submit, but not out of obligation or fear, but out of the identity that Jesus has given to them. He tells them your love and devotion to Jesus, that ought to be what spurs you on to obey and honor your parents. And you Roman fathers, we kind of flip it to the other side. Society says that you can do whatever you want with your kids, but don't. Submit your lives to them, love them, serve them, uplift them, empower them. Give your life daily for them, not just in the big stuff, but in every action and decision you make, because that's what it looks like to love like Jesus. Finally, Paul, he moves on to an area that we're not really as familiar with today. He says, "Slaves, obey your human masters in everything. Don't work only while being watched in order to please men, but work wholeheartedly, fearing the Lord." Are you starting to notice a theme here? Shortly after Paul continues, he says, "Masters, supply your slaves with what is right and fair." Since you know that you have a master in heaven also. Today, we consider the institution of slavery to be repulsive. And we really should, right? It's a terrible act to enslave another person. But in the first century Rome, it was an entrenched reality that you couldn't alter and you couldn't ignore. Paul didn't condone slavery, but again, his agenda is not to treat the symptoms of a broken world system. In every instruction he gives, his goal is to guide believers on how to live within their daily realities. And so what does he tell slaves? He says, you have power, you have value, you have rights. Your situation in life is completely unfair and wrong. And truth be told, you have every right to deceive your master since you're not his property. Don't. Instead, lay down those rights and work like you're working for Jesus. Let your honor and significance come from him as you allow him to use you to bring change to the messed up environment that you found yourself in. And then you masters, Roman law says you have absolute power over slaves, but you don't. Surrender that power and see them as Jesus sees them. Not as property, but as people with value. See them as your equal and treat them as your equal. Use the authority that you've been given by society to take care of them, to treat them with kindness and fairness. Guys, don't you see it? The power structures of our world, they attempt to take away rights and value and dignity from people. But Jesus, he came to establish a world that empowers all people, regardless of what the world says about them. Not only this, but Jesus, he calls all of us to be responsible to one another by giving up the things that we're entitled to, because love always, always, always involves submission. As I've processed all this, I've thought about how we as humans, we tend to see everything wrong with society, and then our first instinct is to bring about change by attacking the problem. And so what do? We complain and we argue and we protest, and then there are moments we fight, right? And don't get me wrong, sometimes these things are necessary and good, but this wasn't Paul's strategy for bringing change to this world. And it wasn't what he called us followers of Jesus to do either. Instead, he advised us to spend our energy giving the world a picture of a different reality than what they were used to seeing. He says, show them the beauty of what it looks like when Christ-like submission is put into practice. And if you think about it, this makes sense. You don't cure a disease by merely treating the symptoms. You go after the source. And in the case of our world, we are plagued with a broken way of seeing life and seeing people. Our world desperately needs a reality transplant. And just like any other transplant that happens in the body, doctors, they don't focus on fixing the defective body part. Instead, they give their attention to preparing the way for the new thing that's coming in. And this is what Paul does in calling us as followers of Jesus to submit and imitate Jesus in our relationships. So often my conception of serving Jesus is that I have to do something big for him. That's where it's at. I get caught in the trap of thinking that if I'm not doing something on a grand scale, then what I'm doing is not really significant. And can I just say that's such a lie? Because if there's only one message that you take from this series, I hope it's this. Real world transformation, it isn't about the larger than life things that we do out in the world. It's not about our mind-blowing acts of heroism and boldness. God's kingdom is most effectively built, and this world is transformed and changed when we as followers of Jesus demonstrate Christ-like submission in the seemingly insignificant everyday circumstances of our lives. And this is why, because it's in the seemingly insignificant everyday acts of submission where you and I most powerfully demonstrate the love and power of Jesus. Because you can't fake Christ-like submission. We can't manufacture or maintain it in our own strength or determination. It can't happen. It's impossible. It only happens when you and I live in the power of Jesus and allow His Spirit to flow through us. Not by trusting ourselves, but by choosing to root our hearts and our minds and our lives completely in Him.